Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Can someone out there in the audience just wave their hand? Great. Okay. For those of you who I have not had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Raul Carrillo, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Law and Political Economy Project. Thank you for joining us from all around the world. As you know, we had hoped to gather in April 2020 for the LPE Democracy Beyond Neoliberalism conference. While we were disappointed not to be able to come together in person, we are thrilled to be hosting our reconstructed virtual conference series, thanks to the generosity, patience, and hard work of our community. Our entire lineup of events and registration links, as well as a sneak peek at the upcoming blog symposia, are now available on our website, where you can also sign up for conference-specific updates and reminders. Our next event is our conference plenary, Radical Legal Imaginaries, with Amna Akbar, Aziz Rana, and Dorothy Roberts, moderated by LPE Project Co-Director Amy Kapczynski on Thursday, February 8th at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. It is my pleasure to introduce today's student moderator, Ashley Burke, Georgetown University Law Center, class of 2022, founder and co-chair of the Georgetown Law and Political Economy Society, and executive director of the Modern Money Network. Ashley's current research focuses on housing and eviction defense. Prior to attending law school, she received an MSc in development economics from Oxford University. Please take it away, Ashley.
Thank you, Raul. I am incredibly excited to be here for this conversation. In a moment, I'll introduce our panelists, who are all doing groundbreaking work at the intersection of international law and the legal structuring of money. After I introduce them, they will each take some time to describe their projects, after which they'll have a chance to discuss the commonalities in their work. Thank you so much to Raul and the LPE project for convening this panel. This group has so much to offer. Every one of them is pushing the boundaries of thought on money, hierarchy, capitalism, and international law. And I literally can't wait to hear what they have to say. So let's get started. John Haskell is a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester Law School and junior faculty at the Institute for Global Law and Policy, IGLP, Harvard Law School. At Manchester, he co-directs the Law and Technology Initiative and the Manchester International Law Center. Prior to Manchester, he was a Fulbright scholar and held tenure-track academic appointments in the UK and US law schools. He is an executive board member of the Association for the Promotion of Political Economy and Law, editor at Crypto Law Review, and guest blogger on law school markets at Faculty Lounge. For this panel, he has submitted a piece that examines the epistemological intersection between economists studying modern monetary theory and international lawyers associated with the critical traditions within the discipline. Drawing from personal experience, he suggests the possibility of fruitful collaboration between these groups. Nathan Tankis is a writer and researcher born and living in New York City. He's the author of a popular and much referenced blog, Notes on the Crisis, to which I am a subscriber, you should too, which covers the play-by-play of current pandemic-induced global depression and how policymakers should respond to it, as well as assessing how they actually are responding. He's been featured in Bloomberg for his incisive and widely followed commentary on the inner workings of the Federal Reserve. For this panel, he has submitted his comprehensive blog post on the Federal Reserve's international response to the COVID-19 pandemic, including central bank liquidity swap lines. Karina Patricio Ferreira Lima is a lecturer in commercial law at the University of Leeds. She's currently completing her PhD at Durham Law School, where she has held the highly competitive and prestigious Modern Law Review Scholarship and Durham Law School Studentship. Karina's research interests center on the constitutive role of law over the world's economic organization, with a particular focus on international economic law. Her areas of expertise include global economic governance, international financial institutions, and the international legal architecture of money and finance. Her dissertation, Legal Political Economy of Sovereign Insolvency Governance, explores how law on sovereign debt exercises a distributive role within the debtor state and across the global economy. By unpacking the legal infrastructures through which the existing legal governance of sovereign debt restructuring creates and perpetuates inequality and asymmetries within debtor states and across the globe, her thesis discusses the potential of law to achieve transformative change in the field of sovereign debt. Rowan Gray is an assistant professor of law at Willamette University. His research focuses on the legal design and regulation of money and finance, including digital fiat currency, as well as broader issues of law and political economy. He is the president of the Modern Money Network, a network manager with the Freedom Box Foundation, and a research fellow for the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity. He is also a director of the National Jobs for All Network and a member of Class Crits and the Association for the Promotion of Political Economy and the Law. For this panel, he submitted his piece on the international law of digital currency, which lays out the implications of the digitization of money for economic production, global governance, and the maturation of information capitalism. And with that, John, if you want to take it away.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Raul. Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, LPE team. So I submitted a paper to share with you, but what I thought I would do in this time together that we have is just sort of step back and talk a little bit about sort of like how I got there to even think about this and specifically speak to political economy and law. And my feeling is that oftentimes political economy as this word, as this rhetorical trope, we sort of, there's this language that we're like turning to it, or it's some new phenomena. And you definitely can see that in the literature. The word shows up a lot. It seems like things are happening, but oftentimes it's hard to know what we're really talking about or what's really new that's going on. Just because it pops up doesn't mean it's the same thing as actually changing the disciplinary consciousness, its argumentative patterns. And oftentimes, the more you sort of drill in, the more things oftentimes look predictable, rehearsed, routinized into all sorts of familiar framings. What I want to do is talk about a few of those familiar framings and then share with you why I think like thinking about money and an investment is sort of something that actually might be new. So here's some familiar framings. The first one, the private is political, efficiency is actually, private's public, efficiency is political, formal equality hides inequality. Essentially, any private individual economic phenomena, contracts, prices, etc., takes place within some sort of background institutional regime that arrange the distribution of entitlements, assigns value, influences behavior, and so forth. So a lot of the literature, it just seems like we're doing versions of that. In addition to that, we also perform a lot of familiar rhetorical moves. So oftentimes we do translation projects. If you're on the right, you say, let me draw from some economic tradition and I'll bring that to law. Or if you're on the left, let me draw from history or sociology or anthropology and bring it into the law. Oftentimes we do myth busting. You thought the market, it was the market, but it's actually politics. You thought it was progress, it's actually colonialism. We do a lot of fancy theory. If you're like sort of like liberal, post-liberal, left of center, you footnote Polanyi. If you're if you signal the left, you maybe talk about Marx or someone like that. Essentially, what we usually do in these sort of moves is it's sort of this enlightenment idea that you can have a cognitive revolution. I'll tell you something you don't know. It blows your mind. And that leads to actually some sort of collective or individual behavioral change. So free your mind, the rest will follow. If you build it, they will come. It's that idea that the politics is in the writing. So you have these familiar framings, and then you have these rhetorical moves that are oftentimes similar, feels very familiar, the script. And then on top of that, we operate usually within tensions that have been around since at least the 1960s. So that move between contingency and individualism, how to look at phenomena versus systemic structural sort of patterns. Or we also see the tension between, like, on the one side, law or the autonomy of legal logic or the internal perspective of law versus its politics or it's something that's non-law. And we sort of grapple between those sort of tensions that really have never been resolved. Okay, and when we think about capital itself, even though the word capitalism has started to show up a lot, when we think about what we mean when we talk about capitalism or capital, it tends to gravitate towards thinking about capital as either some natural resource, for example, land, labor, or some fixed productive asset, like a factory, or maybe pre-existing wealth that then they tell you we have to go and tax. That's essentially what's there. And so that's how I found, at least, when I started reading this political economy literature and getting excited about it, and am excited about it. But it seemed like so often was sort of like traveling in that maze. And what's been interesting for me, at least personally, and why, for example, modern money theory was really important in my own sort of thinking, is that it suddenly turned the picture over as being someone who was trained originally in public international law to starting to think about investment, capitalization, and specifically about the character of money itself. What I thought I'd do is just talk for 2 or 3 minutes just about that sort of turn and some things that have been like that I've been sort of into about that. So the first is, that's not to say that the literature right now doesn't talk about money. It's just that when it talks about money, it thinks of money as this sort of commodity. It comes out of barter exchange. It slowly develops. And this is whether you're a self-subscribed Marxist or if you're on the right or a liberal. There's always this idea that money is some sort of scarce commodity, or that it hides the real way power operates, something like that, as a commodity. So I want to think about it differently from this literature. So I think 3 things come up. First is that once we think of money and capitalism as balance sheet operations, so the stuff of corporate accounting and finance, the first thing it does is it reshifts the villains in our story. We write a lot about the economists being a problem. How many stories do we know about the Mont Pelerin Society? But it would change us to start thinking about the accountants, the HR, the management, the business schools. And that's where a lot of the action seems to actually be at with things over the last 100 years, how they've developed. And maybe we could shift our focus there. Once we start thinking of money as a credit, debt, asset, liability, balance sheet operation, a legally created IOU, that gives us new policy space for thinking about what we could design as the way forward. So among critical international lawyers, they do a really good job of critiquing the international system, showing that behind this formally neutral, equal sovereigns, there's a hierarchy of power. But when it comes time to think about what to do about it, it's very difficult. It's usually, well, we have to redistribute, or, well, we have to free up production. It's very difficult to know exactly programmatically how to address things. And one of the things that MMT, for example, showed, or once we start thinking about money, we start getting more into the heart of power and how it operates. Critical international lawyers usually say, hey, look, if you're going to change the system, it's got to happen with the great hegemons, right? Because they're controlling the international order. And so with certain systems, once you start thinking about the financial architecture of the world, it also starts honing in right at where power really operates in these countries and where. And the third thing I think it does is it gives us a working definition of capitalism. I mean, that's one of those things, people use it a lot, but it's very hard to get our sort of hands around what we mean by it. So for me, once I start thinking of capitalism in terms of money as a balance sheet operation, I start thinking about capitalization. And capitalization, I sort of wrote out a definition I thought I would share. I think it's the assignment of pecuniary value to a legal asset in the present based on its expected future earnings, subtracting for risks, depreciation costs, and so forth. And that process has been put in the hands of private financial business people. And the story of that process taking over every aspect of our social life is the story of capitalism. So I think I'll close out with there. I'm happy to talk more about stuff. But I think for me, with political economy, right now where it stands, we're at a crossroads. It might be a new way that certain disciplines that are seen as progressive or heterodox reproduce conversations that they've been having for a period of time. You were doing law and development, you were doing globalization, you were doing post-colonialism, etc. Here's a new literary playground to bring a lot of those ideas over and reproduce and do again. Or we could start, it actually opens the door to doing something a little new. Instead of talking about trade, we start talking about investment. instead of just talking about capital, right, with commodities and all the interesting studies, we start talking about the nature of money. And I think this is where, for me at least, I've been most excited about starting to look. So thanks for letting me share.
Thanks, Sean. That was really interesting. Next up, I think, is Nathan, or is it Karina?
Is it me? I think it's me, right?
Go for it, Karina.
Isn't it? Am I wrong, Nathan? Okay, right. Thanks. So yeah, before I start this presentation, just let me just give a shout out to the organizers of this conference. I think they've done an amazing job in the last, 15 months or so in organizing it. So first the original edition, of course, and then the online one. So and also what I really enjoy about this conference is the grassroots organization of it with all the student-led LPE groups. So many thanks for this. And also let me just say how happy I am to be in this panel with such amazing friends. So thank you. So in my presentation, I want to talk about my thesis on the legal political economy of sovereign insolvency governance. I submitted the introduction as a discussion paper. This issue is becoming particularly relevant as the economic impact of the pandemic threatens new rounds of sovereign debt crisis in the world. We can discuss that later. But the problem is not new at all. And despite all the transformations that occurred in international financial architecture in the last century, international law has historically failed to address sovereign insolvency in a systematic way. As you may know, sovereign insolvency is currently dealt with through debt restructuring processes governed by a purely transactional legal framework. It relies on ad hoc arrangements between the debtor state and different groups of increasingly diversified creditors. In fact, the creditor base of sovereign debt is now the most diversified in history, including various types of bondholders, commercial creditors, commercial banks, multilateral creditors, bilateral creditors, and so on, which are governed by contractual technologies and in competing codes of conduct. Negotiations involve a multiplicity of agents from the debtor state and to international organizations, firms, and international fora with no legal personality under international law. In some, the law does not offer any collective procedure to address the problem of sovereign insolvency. As you may know, the question of whether international law should have a role in sovereign insolvency governance by establishing sovereign bankruptcy rules has been subject to a long-standing debate. There is a big controversy between those that support contract-based arrangements for dealing with sovereign insolvency, such as the use of collective action clauses, and those that advocate for a sovereign bankruptcy mechanism. This debate has massively evolved since the early 2000s, and particularly since the global financial crisis. So this is where my research fits. The research joins this discussion on the role of law in sovereign insolvency by telling a new story on why we need sovereign bankruptcy rules. And it does so on three main grounds, which I will discuss in this presentation briefly. The first of them relates to the relationship between sovereign insolvency and monetary power. And this is why I am in this panel, which is about money, right? So in my research, I found that the literature on sovereign debt so far has been pretty much fiscal focused. My research challenges this view and postulates that sovereign debt crises in the global periphery are an inherent feature of the international monetary system as we currently know it. We need a radically new narrative on that because so far, sovereign debt crises have been pictured as the sole product of fiscal misfortunes or mismanagement. So misfortunes could be any type of episode that falls outside the reasonable control of the state, such as disasters, natural disasters, economic and political shocks, and so on. And mismanagement includes so-called fiscal profligacy and corruption. This type of narrative postulates that that developing and emerging economies are more subject to insolvency due to the alleged inferior quality of their institutions, which is said to systematically cause mismanagement of sovereign debt or undermine their capacity to respond to their own misfortunes. While misfortune and mismanagement may help explaining some or any given insolvency episode, my research concerns the root causes of sovereign insolvency. I am interested in understanding how monetary power generates background asymmetries in the ability of states to avoid becoming insolvent. Crucially, I contend that as long as the international monetary system is structured on the basis of a global hierarchy of currencies, sovereign debt crises will not disappear. They are inherent to the asymmetric character of global liquidity. This means that liquidity has a cyclical character in the global periphery and a counter-cyclical character in the core. So during booms, many contracts will look safe and private actors are more prone to engage in financial contracts denominated in peripheral currencies, which typically reward higher interest rates. But during bursts, the perceptions on asset safety will quickly change, and peripheral currencies will be more vulnerable to rapid withdrawals from contracts denominated in those currencies. So the least monetarily powerful states are more prone to exchange rate fluctuations caused by international liquidity booms and bursts, which causes cyclical structural illiquidity problems and therefore sovereign insolvency crisis. To change this, we need to reset the international monetary system. But until that happens, sovereign bankruptcy rules should be conceived as a critical matter of global justice. The second element in my argument is to understand the various legal infrastructures that respond to sovereign insolvency, such as statutes, contracts, judicial decisions, IMF memorandums, IMF debt sustainability assessments, and so on, as part of a single system of governance. A brief note on what I call legal infrastructures. This includes any kind of legal rules of all kinds, hard law, soft law rules in different jurisdictions and also in international law. In my research, I found that legal scholarship commonly conceives those legal infrastructures as disconnected from each other. To some extent, this is understandable because sovereign insolvency governance lies at the intersection of several different public, private, international, domestic law rules. And when I say domestic law, this includes various jurisdictions as well. However, a holistic approach to this challenge is necessary because if we split those topics within the traditional categories used in the legal discipline, this prevents a systematic understanding of how they work. And despite belonging to different areas of law and jurisdictions, those legal infrastructures systematically interact as a system of governance that imposes rigidity in the law to the global periphery while being unable to solve background insolvency problems. Basically, those legal infrastructures I identify, there are several of them, but two of them are core legal infrastructures. And the first is the role of the core jurisdictions on sovereign debt contracts, which are the state of New York and England and Wales. And in sovereign insolvency scenarios, when resources are by definition insufficient to honor all claims on the debt to state's budget, those jurisdictions act in a kind of strange de-risking way that I don't have time to discuss exactly all the contractual and judicial mechanisms of this, but this could be left to the Q&A. By de-risking those claims through law and judicial decisions, they create de facto priorities in the allocation of losses among key stakeholders of sovereign insolvency. I will return to the allocation of losses point in a second, which is the third ground of my argument. And the second core pillar of the system is the role performed by the IMF in sovereign insolvency governance. Those roles are twofold. First, the IMF acts as an international lender of last resort that provides the necessary liquidity to guarantee short and medium-term foreign currency denominated sovereign debt. In doing so, it ensures the full performance contracts. Yet there is something significant about the fund's legal mandate as an international lender of last resort, which is that it's meant to solve liquidity problems, temporary liquidity problems, and not insolvency problems. This point has a lot of complexities because the line between illiquidity and insolvency is subject to contention, and creditors, particularly private creditors, have an interest in delaying the explicit recognition of sovereign insolvency problems because of the circumstance, because if there is an insolvency problem, they cannot expect to recover the face value of their claims. In this context, the IMF holds a significant power because it has a power to determine whether debt is sustainable or not, and whether, therefore, there is a liquidity or an insolvency problem. And this decision has major distributive implications, because if the IMF considers that restructuring is not necessary or considerably underestimates the magnitude of the restructuring required, the state, the injection of IMF liquidity will cause a major reallocation of risk between the stakeholders of the insolvency. I will return to the stakeholders in a second, which is the third point that I mentioned. So I contend that in the post-Bretton Woods era, the fund has acquired what I call a structural bias towards embracing the illiquidity problem hypothesis. This means that the IMF tends to portray insolvency problems as temporary liquidity problems and enables the approval of new lending. And this practice, there are soft law rules that enable it about debt sustainability assessments and extraordinary exceptional financing that I cannot discuss now, but these are all soft law frameworks. And this comes at the expense of transferring the risk to other stakeholders who are required to bear the costs of insolvency and the losses. This is a sort of radical risk reallocation, which is instrumentalized through conditionality that aims to ensure the prompt recovery of IMF resources through adjustment shocks in the debtor state. Those policies ensure the recovery of the IMF loan, but the content of those policies is well-known austerity policies, and it often violates the IMF's mandate of restoring balance of payments equilibrium without resorting to the worst effects of the contractionary adjustments typical of the gold standard. This is a dysfunctional system that creates risk allocation, a type of risk allocation in which certain types of claims are de-risked at the expense of reallocating risk to others, which takes me to my third and last point. I draw on corporate bankruptcy theory and propose understanding sovereign insolvency governance as a common pool problem, where the resources are by definition insufficient to honor all lawful claims on the debtor state. And this interpretation draws on research about the redistributive role of corporate bankruptcy laws by scholars such as Jackson, Barrett, Warren, drawing on heterodox economics, and my MMT friends in this panel will agree. It becomes clear that the solvency constraint of a sovereign state in foreign currency is to some extent analogous to that of a private agent in the market, which justifies this analogy with corporate bankruptcy law. So in this context, the absence of bankruptcy rules means that there is no collective procedure that distributes losses and risk among key stakeholders. Similarly to the common pool in corporate bankruptcy, the stakeholders in the pool are heterogeneous and have disparate levels of power to enforce their claims. In particular, the power of each stakeholder is shaped by the boundaries of a fragmentary setting of legal rules and institutions that constitute sovereign insolvency governance, in which claims of different nature have asymmetric enforcement mechanisms. Unless bankruptcy rules are introduced that establish a collective procedure to distribute losses based on justifiable legal hierarchies, stakeholders will typically seek to enforce their claims and drive others to take on losses through whichever legal mechanisms they have available. This process tends to disadvantage the weakest stakeholders in the pool and strengthen the position of the most powerful ones. Thus, for instance, private creditors under the core jurisdictions are more likely to be able to enforce their claims than others, and shorter term creditors are more likely to have their claims de-risked by the IMF. However, this comes at the cost of reallocating risk to other stakeholders in the pool, notably the population of the debtor state in the form of IMF-imposed austerity, and longer-term investments whose repayment prospects are compromised by the longer-term negative developmental implications of IMF conditionality. Longer-term investments of all kinds, as we know, are important and crucial in financing for achieving the UN's SDGs and addressing the global environmental crisis. The result of this is a model of financial extractivism that rewards short-termism in the global periphery, while being unable to solve the background insolvency problem, disincentivizing productive financing and rewarding speculation. So, well, yes, I guess this is all for now. Thanks a lot for your time. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Karina. So much interesting material there. So I think next is actually going to be Nathan now.
Yes. Hi, everyone. As mentioned earlier, I gave a link to one of my early pieces from last year to give a flavor of some of my thoughts about money in an international context, but my talk is going to be more based on ongoing work. And so, when I organized a few of these type of panels, this panel was conceived in 2019, and obviously events took us in a different direction. And we also had an event at or a panel at the Appeal Conference in 2019. And one of the things I said then, and I think is really the theme of what I want to put forward in talking about international law of money, or as that panel was, monetary sovereignty and international law, is that we're talking about creating a field that doesn't exist. I think this is a really important point. There isn't really an active study of monetary sovereignty as such in the international law context. There is, and most of what in the 20th century has gone under the label of monetary sovereignty is really this sort of formalist law of currency issuers. It's just the law of that you're allowed to issue a currency or who's allowed to issue a currency. And it doesn't really get more into the fundamental dynamics of monetary sovereignty as perhaps we would consider it macroeconomically as who is limited in their ability to act and who isn't. And there's could be a lot to be said about this topic, but the fundamental point is that there are entities that could have an international legal right to issue a currency that, in legal realist, or maybe more properly neo-chartalist terms, have very limited monetary sovereignty. There's neo-chartalism, or as it's known, MMT, has a lot to say about that phenomenon of entities that have a currency issuer status and nonetheless very limited monetary sovereignty for various reasons. And so that what that necessarily means is that developing an international law of monetary sovereignty, or an international law of money, requires bringing in new analytical frameworks to reinterpret many different areas of international law in the context of monetary macroeconomic issues, or maybe monetary political economy issues, rather than rediscussing this formalist literature on monetary sovereignty, or lex moneta, which is kind of very narrow and constrained literature that only has kind of a few foundational works that don't really deal with macroeconomics as such. And as I said, there can be a number of different ways of approaching this kind of topic. But this, my talk here is going to focus on foreign denominated debt, and in fact is only going to focus on private foreign denominated debt, whereas Karina just talked about a public foreign denominated debt and the problems and difficulties that sometimes come with foreign denominated debt. From to reemphasize there, what we're trying to get at with that issue is the ways in which certain forces constrain the monetary sovereignty of entities that are nonetheless currency issuers, and ways in which those limitations and constraints can be loosened. And one major constraint is a burden of foreign denominated debt, whether it's debt that's been freely taken on, or it's debt that has been imposed, say by treaty, reparations, indemnity treaties, especially important historical sources of foreign denominated debt. And once you have a burden of foreign denominated debt, those constrain policy options in some ways that can reproduce those burdens of foreign denominated debt through time, especially as if you can't get rid of them in some sort of bankruptcy or organized default process, and that can also create certain private sector dynamics where your domestic private sector takes out foreign denominated debt for various reasons. So what I'm going to focus on here is the developmental goal of shrinking the private sector, your private sector's, quote unquote, your private sector's reliance on and their burden of foreign denominated debt without destabilizing exchange rates or trade finance, and where you can avoid the sanction of other legal systems, because there's all sorts of international legal regimes which constrain or limit how you design your domestic laws, or at least with how you design your domestic laws without foreign retaliation. There's a lot of, and that's a huge area of work. There's potentially a wide range of areas where there are constraints imposed by international law that have relevance to even just this quote unquote narrow issue of the burden and reliance on private foreign denominated debt. One really obvious place to start is with bankruptcy for private entities or for corporate incorporated entities. In this area, the main international law that you have to be concerned with is the UN Model Law on Bankruptcy. This is an example, I think, where there is an especially rich area where thinking about monetary macroeconomics can really help, because the UN Model Law on Bankruptcy, which is comes from the peak of the neoliberal 1990s, has as one of its major principles that you can't, quote unquote, legally discriminate against foreign creditors. So the idea is, you're supposed to implement a bankruptcy regime that is, quote unquote, fair, and you can't impose harsher terms on foreign creditors than domestic creditors, which of course, as a consequence is a sop to keeping up the burden of external debts on domestic policy, on how domestic policy functions. But without the macroeconomic analysis that we'd bring to this, what the UN model bankruptcy law does not have any specific restrictions on discriminating against foreign denominated debt. For example, lowering foreign denominated debts in bankruptcy. Notionally, a domestic creditor, and often they do, own foreign denominated debts, owns, for example, dollar denominated assets. And so in this sense, you can take a policy which isn't necessarily or isn't explicitly or formally discriminating against foreign creditors, that would nonetheless likely impact external debts much more than they would impact domestic debts. And of course, from a monetary sovereignty point of view, domestic actors relying on holding dollar-denominated assets, even if it's, quote unquote internal within a country, isn't necessarily desirable anyway. So this is an area where the legal system can discriminate against foreign-denominated debt without running afoul of international agreements that reference the UN model law on bankruptcy. So that's like one example, which in some sense is small, but in some sense, is big and has very big implications for pursuing, the kind of legal changes that you would need to create some legal space for domestic actors, especially actors, in the global South. In this context, it's also, of course, the last thing I'll mention is financial regulation, and specifically around domestic financial institutions and their dollar-denominated liabilities. Very famously, many financial institutions, many countries. The most recent one where that's been very important is Lebanon. Issue foreign denominated deposits. Often is this sort of exchange rate protection for domestic actors, but also to attract foreign customers, or quote unquote foreign investors. And this has obvious destabilizing impacts when suddenly you have financial institutions who are short dollar liquidity and will do anything to get that dollar liquidity. And financial regulation is an obvious tool to outright ban the issue of dollar deposits. And if that's impossible or undesirable for some specific reason, make them more difficult to access, make them more difficult to issue, impose costs for their issuance. And this is, one specific area where you can create more space and reduce burdens of foreign denominated debt that don't necessarily come from some legacy debt or from just what was quote unquote necessary to engage in trade finance, but something that financial institutions engage in for specific financial reasons or customer service reasons, which aren't in the in a broader developmental program interest. So there's a lot more that is to be explored on the topic of monetary sovereignty and international law. But this is, I felt, was a good little taste of what that kind of program would be, or the kind of areas of law that we should look at to both see where the constraints are and then see where it's possible to loosen the constraints with specific kinds of analytical visions, which I don't think have been brought to these topics, as even in heterodox economics, a legal perspective has not been tapped or activated very much at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. So Rowan is up next. I'm already really excited to ask questions based on the three speakers we've had. And I just want to remind everybody watching that you can submit questions to the Q&A. So please do if you have caught up on any commonalities or just questions that you have for the panelists. Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Rowan. I think you're still on mute.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the organizers putting this together and the other panelists. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm talking about digital currency, and the reason I want to sort of frame my whole talk around this is because my big argument, or the thing that I want to take away, and recognizing that this is a common trope or something you hear in a lot of different contexts, and the debate kind of goes back and forth around this question, is this idea that sort of digital currency changes things, or at least changes the way in which we can approach our understanding of the international law of money. And some of that is substantive, and some of that is sort of optical or symbolic, and some of that is just maybe we could say sort of smart political strategy. But my argument is that if you're interested in the future of international money and the international law of money, that going into that world and into those debates from the perspective of kind of the future of digital currency is a constructive and potentially quite impactful way to do that. So one of the reasons why I think that's important is because for better or worse, debates right now over the design and regulation of digital money have become effectively a proxy for debates about the future of money in general. Obviously, there are ways in which the technology refracts into other areas, whether that's sort of fiscal and monetary policy at the domestic level or at the international level with the kinds of questions that Karina and Nathan were just talking about. But it's also that it changes the kinds of questions we're asking and the kinds of starting assumptions, sort of similar to the way that John was talking about in his talk. At least in my experience, I've found that very sort of fundamental first principle kind of questions that would often be considered the realm of cranks or maybe your first year undergraduate sort of seminar, we get to talk about big issues before you get concrete, come back in once you start bringing in kind of the technological dimension or asking about where the future of monetary technology goes. People become a lot more open-minded, a lot more willing to think about the big questions without sort of immediately relegating the conversation to sort of crank status or too abstract to be meaningful. So you can relitigate things when you add tech at the end of them that you might not otherwise be able to relitigate. The other thing I've found that is that when we talk about the sort of changing nature of technology, whether or not it's actually true, it functions as a kind of imperial layer on top of any question that we're looking at. So thinking about, for example, whether we should be regulating certain new kinds of assets like cryptocurrencies and things as a commodity or a currency or a security, in many respects, those categories reflect a historical moment in time when those different industries or different parts of the financial system operated under a certain arrangement of legal institutions, of social institutions, and those categories themselves are in flux now, even as we're trying to apply them to new technologies or new practices. So one of the questions may be, are we even asking the right questions about how to regulate international money or apply international law principles to money when the ground underneath us is shifting? And the example I often use when I'm teaching this is, if you were in the sort of 1970s and someone said, well, what's the law of the fax machine going to look like in 2020? Right? Well, we still actually send documents or send information through networks between devices that has a function relatively similar to a fax machine if you've ever had to, fill out an online PDF form or something. But nowadays we would consider that really folded into the law of the internet or general IT networks. And there are a lot of questions around particular architecture or infrastructure of money and finance that I think we're going to look back on in future generations and understand as a subcategory or a component of some new kind of network or new infrastructure that we're in the process of building now. The more you can lean into that, the more it can be the future that you can influence or control. Because going back to my point about the sort of first principles or first questions becoming more open to debate when you frame them around the future of technology, a lot of people also become a lot less sanguine about their expertise in those moments. So central bankers that typically consider themselves sort of at the commanding heights of macroeconomics, for example, have to confront their own limited expertise and their own limited understanding when it comes to, for example, information technology or the laws surrounding digital networks and data generation, simply because it's just been outside their wheelhouse for so long. They've been keeping abreast of the relevant technical competencies when it comes to accounting or even legal principles, but faced with the sort of influx of new technical competency around technology in the last 20 or 30 years, I think they're behind, and that represents an opening for people trying to change things or to bring in new voices into those spaces. If we look at the history, we can see that there are sort of different trends here. On one hand, there are sort of what we might consider private currencies or from private sector generated energy. So obviously things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies have a historical origin in the 2008 crisis, often as a reaction against public bailouts and against what they perceive to be the sort of inequities of the banking system and the structural instabilities of the banking system. Others like David Globier have traced the sort of right wing political history of those ideas rooted in white supremacy, rooted in a desire for a kind of hard money that supports creditors and supports existing property owners. But there's also another tradition going back to the 80s, which was what we could call the cypherpunk tradition. It was really internet freedom activists who saw the future of digitally networked technology as fundamentally at risk of totalitarianism and surveillance, and began to try and build technologies to oppose that. A lot of their worldview arguably was based on a misplaced understanding of money, and I'll get back to that in a second. But basically, it meant that because they had a sort of perhaps a decent theory of totalitarianism and a bad theory of how money works, they ended up placing their hope and faith in private currencies that was sort of arguably misplaced, and a better monetary theory could have avoided that. And more recently, a lot of that energy has perhaps sort of tragically been redirected into instruments that are called stable coins. The idea of a stable coin as distinct from, say, a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is that it's supposed to piggyback off the public dollar or the unit of account, so that its value on one hand is about being a private payments technology or a private currency technology, but on the other, its monetary value is very strongly dependent on the state system and the fiat currency system in which it operates. So in that respect, it's really closer to kind of the mobile money systems that we saw in the mid 2000s, usually coming from the global south, places like Kenya. And at least to me, this is actually less of a story about sort of the internet building a utopia away from public governance in the sort of John Perry Barlow Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace mold, and actually just the latest iteration of a history of, shall we say, sort of payments innovation that goes back to the rise of the telegraph in the 19th century. You know, we're sort of talking about really the origins of the internationally networked financial system. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of these new stable coins actually kind of look like PayPal. And that PayPal, when it first came into existence, got a payments operator license that was first designed for Western Union, which was one of the very first international payments telegraph networks. And so while on one hand, there are new forms of cryptography and things that change the debate around payments technology, in many respects, this is actually a 150-year-old story that goes back to the first time we digitally networked communications. But we're also seeing this sort of more recently rise of public digital currency, and even the language and the metaphors we're using there is instructive. We're talking about central bank digital currency. I prefer the term digital fiat currency because that's a broader framework that doesn't presume that central banks are the only actors. But we can already see how debates over the future of digital currency are reflecting the sort of neoliberal assumptions of our current era, that central banks shall be the driver's seat, that in fact what we need is to take accounting systems, bank account systems, and upgrade them, and that really we should be sort of incremental about this and only react to sort of external developments. And having followed this space for probably 7 or 8 years now, it was extremely notable that the minute Facebook's Libra was announced, now called Diem, which would be the sort of stable coin to end all stable coins, was when central bankers finally switched from saying that these digital currency technologies were interesting but not coming anytime soon to actually saying, no, they're here right now and we have to do something about them. So there are sort of big competencies that I think we have to think about, building on the kind of specific knowledge of, say, for example, public sovereign debt that Nathan and Karina were talking about. One is that we need to think about, obviously, the kind of public international law and private international law competencies. And I'm reminded of this great line that Keynes sort of said after the Bretton Woods conferences, where he said, you know, we came as thinking about this as economists, and all the Americans led by Harry Dexter White came thinking by as lawyers, and they kind of wiped the floor with us. It's like one of the few times that Keynes had a really high profile sort of defeat with his political strategy. And the Americans built the system sort of thinking as lawyers rather than thinking as economists. And there are a whole bunch of sort of updated economic or financing competencies we want to think about, whether it's about liquidity for international swap lines or within the financial system through this sort of relationship between shadow banking and banks. One notable point on that is that when we often talk about introducing a digital currency, one of the biggest objections you hear from central bankers is that it will cause a drain of deposits. It will be so successful that people will leave the regular banking system and move into a digital currency. Operationally, there's no problem with that, but substantively, it would cause central banks to have to provide liquidity in a way that would expand their balance sheet, which goes against their sort of ideological preference for not intervening too much in the credit markets. So they don't like that. So we end up with a moment where this sort of economic ideology is actually shaping the policy choices we're making in a very overt way. And we see that also with the payments architecture. So debates right now over whether we want a sort of central bank account for everybody, or whether we also want some sort of bearer instrument that has the legal properties of a token or something where ownership, property rights transfer with the bearer, the owner, rather than an account system. But I'll leave on this last point, which is that I think the new competencies that we need to think about from an international law of money perspective are going to be less about the standard things that we've come from in the money world, that is to say macro, accounting, finance, those questions, and more about things like law enforcement and privacy, the balance between civil liberties and totalitarian surveillance, to do with things like technological design of networked information systems. So can we send information between devices that isn't going to be recorded somewhere else to be surveilled? And lastly, the kinds of future threats of information capitalism and data-driven governance, everything from how we design public payment systems so we can send checks to people in an emergency that doesn't then send information to ICE, or whether we can build a system where you can transact money in the gray economy as a sex worker or a marijuana business without having the feds shut it down or be able to sort of arrest you for criminal conspiracy. So as in the past, economic competency was necessary for lawyers in this space, I think the future, it's going to be a wider range of competencies, and lawyers are going to be still at the center of the conversation.
Thanks, Rowan, and everybody. Wow, there was so much material there, all of it really interesting, a lot of it intersecting. We have a couple questions from the audience, but first, I just wanted to bring up some common themes that I saw in a lot of your presentations. And I wanted to focus first on, this is a question for everybody, but kind of like centered initially on John's piece. So, the very existence of this panel has a lot to do with like existing collaboration between international law scholars and like heterodox economists, people who are into MMT. And I just wanted to get all of your thoughts on like the future of that collaboration. Some of you talked about, like a new discipline that's emerging that is separate from both like international law and heterodox economics. And I feel like all of you have thoughts on where this is going, and I'd like to hear them.
I think I'll grab the first piece of that. I think, well, first of all, I hope that the quote unquote new field that we're making is a field in international law. I mean, international law, just like all other areas of law, has subfields and subfields that are structured by economic thinking. It's just a lot of it. Economic thinking is neoclassical, microeconomic thinking, Coasian, so on. And so I think we're pushing for instead founding and enriching a lot of heterodox macroeconomics, specifically MMT, as the most legally oriented and most monetary oriented extant heterodox macroeconomic school to kind of meld with. But I would hope, I would want it to be a part of international law and part of the kind of newly forming law and macroeconomics gestalt, as it were. But I'm sure other people have similar or somewhat differing thoughts to.
Yeah, for me, I try to think about where we are right now, what's our experience. And so I think of us oftentimes as people in law schools, or either students or academics, oftentimes that, like right now in this space right here. And so I think about, well, what's that tradition been? And for me, at least, I think that what's cool about right now is there's a feeling that we need to build a new left. And on the, it's building on a lot of what happened in the 80s. There was an attempt in the 80s to do it, but the one in the 80s was struggling with in some ways was struggling with different things than what we're struggling with today. Like, I think our moment right now, we're much more prone towards thinking about collective answers. We're much more tied to wanting a more inclusive, enfranchised idea about what the party looks like. What kind of party do you want to walk into at the house party? You don't want it to all look like I don't want everyone to look like me, right? You want people from all over and all different, like you want a mix, right? And that's taken a lot more seriously, I think, which is a major deal. And there's a feeling of urgency now that didn't used to be there. Probably because it's a little bit more democratic. It used to be a relatively small elite cadre. You could do the Manhattan Death March, and you went to Yale and then Harvard, and then but you didn't want to go to the investment firms, so instead you went into academia. That was the cohort that was sort of, quasi class traders, or at least people willing to cause a little friction within their establishments. There's a much broader group of people now involved in this. And they feel the sense of precarity and urgency. So in all those ways, I think we're in a new space. So for me, it's how to double down on that, not just how to learn from the right wing about what they did to gain into ascendancy, because they had a lot of big money behind them. We don't have that big money behind us. So trying to learn some of those lessons from before, but from this new place. And like Nathan said, bring in the European and UK and outside that Euro-Anglo-American sphere into the conversation, deepen the existing networks, broaden into new groups, especially make inroads in business, accounting, start retraining sort of clerks in the courts, legislative aides, starting to think about real concrete wins that we can get. Those are the sort of things that have been most exciting to me that I've been listening to from people.
Karina, do you have? No. So I guess from my point of view, I'm a relatively practical sort of person when it comes to my academic work. I sort of like to focus around sort of problems or big policy ideas and structure it from there. I think, if you think about some of the things that MMT has been focusing, obviously it wants to analyze and understand the system well, but it's also trying to keep a kind of policy program centered in where it's focusing in the questions it's asking so that it stays relevant to people. And this is, I think, in part a recognition of the modern world. There's just so much content, there's so much material, so much analysis out there. The question of kind of why devote your time to this? Why learn these competencies? Am I going to have to learn how to not only understand the legal system, but understand the sort of financial monetary system and technology? There's a lot there. What's my guiding star? And I think first of all, the kind of legal economic interplay that we've seen coming out of the MMT world has been extremely fruitful, but a lot of the legal side of things has still focused around questions that the heterodox economists are probably more naturally comfortable with. So there's still monetary or macroeconomic questions. And I think if you think about how lawyers think about these issues in general, there are multiple layers of legal analysis, right? You can't separate privacy and civil liberties, for example, from the design of money. You can't say, well, I work on monetary design, but I don't have any views on that question. That is a view on that question. That is taking a position on that. So I think as we want to go forward, the heterodox economists probably can learn from the ecumenical view that lawyers should be taking, where they integrate questions like how to do movement lawyering, how to integrate legal history, how to take issues like white supremacy and police brutality and apply the lessons there into how we design and implement policy in the international law of money. and that, you know, if heterodox economists can try to think in those different languages, even as we push ourselves to do that as lawyers, then the collaboration will be even more fruitful than it already has been.
I think I would look at this from a I think different perspective from also that I would like to add, which is I think heterodox economics can add a great degree of structural change in international law, because I think international law, at least historically, like public international law, is I think the most formalist and idealist area of law that we have. It relies on kind of 19th century thought, you know, sovereign equality. It's like drawing a parallel with contract law, but in the 19th century, before we even had challenges to the will theory or the social value of property, for example, or I think it's still very formalist, and I think heterodox economics can add teeth to the left in terms of international law, because I see a lot of don't get me wrong, like interesting work, but you know, kind of critical international law, but that lacks teeth in terms of how to really transform the structures of international law. So I think it can have a strong, it does have a very strong potential, and I think this is what we are trying to build here, because the opposite of that is international economic law, right? Which is, okay, let's build like a kind of an environment that stands apart from public international law, where we can build the rules for the neoliberal market economy, and they kind of isolated that. And what we are trying to do is to claim an international law that has a powerful potential of changing the global economy, just like international economic law was built, but in a totally different way, in a way that effectively changes how we create and distribute wealth and power.
Yeah, so actually building on that, and then I swear I will stop asking questions and turn to some of the audience questions. So a couple of you at some point, either in your pieces or in the talk that you gave, talked about swap lines, which, you know, has its origination in the Fed, and I think is a really good illustration of the hierarchy of money and monetary sovereignty, and how that relates to the really useful distinction that Karina makes between core and periphery countries. And there, in terms of current events today in Ecuador, is an ongoing election. And Nathan has posted about it, and I would like to hear him talk on that too. And so I'm just interested in maybe a little more like explanation of the sorts of policies that like countries in the periphery can undertake to kind of get out from under the thumb of some of these hierarchies that are imposed by countries in the core.
Yeah, so I'll take a chunk of that. Yeah, obviously there's a lot there. You know, part of the point is that there's so many different areas of law that needs to be rethought in terms of within the framing of monetary sovereignty and international law and macroeconomics and money that you know there's a you know whatever potential program that an individual country or a set of countries would pursue is going to involve a lot of complicated interrelated issues that we're still working on tracing out. But take a little piece of that, talk about swap lines, what swap lines are. First of all, swap lines at their most basic level are just when or central bank liquidity swap lines are simply when central banks lend to each other, and they essentially swap their IOUs, but they're swapping their IOUs is unique and special because their IOUs are, you know, money. They're the money in their area, and so swapping their IOUs is actually quite significant, even though there's no kind of other asset, you know, land or whatever that is collateral for that loan. the fact that that loan is that swap, what's being swapped as a currency, that IOU, is in itself a form of collateral, because you can use it to make payments denominated in that currency, and so sell it on an exchange rate market, and so on and so forth. So in to tie that to what you just asked about, in Ecuador, the election yesterday, the person leading, who will move on to a runoff, Andreas Aruz, is a colleague of ours, an economist, who has written a lot about some of the same issues and talked a lot about some of the same issues around money and macroeconomics. And his big proposal, in terms of responding to the pandemic depression on a global level, is having the IMF issue special drawing rights. Essentially, you can kind of think of it as the IMF's currency, that would be distributed to governments all around the world based on their basically their voting share in the IMF, and this would do a lot to contribute to the foreign exchange reserves of a lot of governments around the world. And we think that's a great proposal, and that we should do everything possible to support that proposal. Now, the problem is that it requires the United States is a deciding vote in pushing that kind of proposal forward in the IMF, and it requires an act of Congress to issue, I think it's more than 600 billion SDRs. So that is, and I wrote early on last year in the crisis about to ensuring the liquidity of SDRs, having the Federal Reserve offer the IMF itself swap lines. So that there's a lot there, but essentially one program is simply to issue SDRs in this crisis and make sure that they are able to do what they need to do in terms of supporting the programs that governments around the world are pursuing. The second, and more generally, swap lines, I think, are an example, a way of peering into ways for different governments to interact with each other and support each other's currencies and exchange rates without entering into currency unions or just forging your governments together. And now currently the swap line system is a very hierarchical system where swap line liquidity is doled out by the dominant Western countries, and then it dribbles down through a set of arrangements down towards certain countries in the global South, but by no means not all of the global South. But it is possible, and definitely government should start considering pursuing swap line arrangements within the global South, as part of kind of South-South trade relationships that our colleague Fadil Kaboub talks about. So obviously there's a lot there, so I definitely didn't tackle everything that's in your question, but that's, I think, like a little chunk of it.
Yeah, I think thinking about what Nathan said and kind of adding a bit also, I think changes can be maybe top down or from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top. I mean, the top down approach would be, I think, what Nathan mentioned, the IMF SDRs. Of course, I think some of the questions are on the banker, the international clearing system. That also, of course, is a proposal that it's been around for St. Keynes proposed it, and of course this would be a structural change. And I think also another area that is very few people are thinking about. I'm thinking maybe I think I might kind of start working on this, which is international regulation of capital flows, something that subsidizes inflows and taxes outflows, like thinking about that kind of arrangement. And I think Nathan will have something to say on that, because there was some kind of debate on capital flows, I think, based on a blog post, if I'm not wrong, that you, well, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but anyway, yeah. And I think the bottom approach would be, I think it really needs a developmental plan, and ultimately you need to create a sustainable source of foreign exchange, because as long as the international system is based on a hierarchy of currencies, which is basically, it's built through individual decisions to trade in the core currency, the basic infrastructure of currency hierarchy is really contracts that are celebrated by all the trade that exists. It's like the aggregates of all those individual decisions, but basically as long as this as currency hierarchy exists, you need to create a sustainable inflow of foreign exchange, and basically also there is room for macro prudential controls of inflows, outflows. That's, I think, what countries can do, and some of them did following the global financial crisis successfully to some extent. So I think this is another area in which I think our discipline, the discipline we are trying to build here should also research on that kind of macro prudential control.
It's such
Yeah,
a, actually, sorry, Ron.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I mean, I think first of all, this is a really good example where a kind of more explicit public international law framework, I think, would bring in actors who should be more involved in the conversation. And people like Karina have been sort of holding up the fort almost alone for a while. There were others, I remember 5 or 6 years ago when this first hit the discourse, people like Katerina Pistor and Perry Merling and Daniela Gabor and Colleen Baker had sort of written about the international law and the political economy implications of this expanded use of swap lines. But if you actually go back to when it happened, it was a sort of 2-page, document by the Fed on a rainy Wednesday. There wasn't much fanfare about it. It revived a previously small part of the Bretton Woods arrangement. But if you actually think about your international economic history classes and stuff like that, we often talk about the sort of post-war Bretton Woods era, then the breakdown to floating exchange rates. And in many respects, the swap line network is the new age of the sort of post-Bretton Woods managed float kind of world. But we haven't had that big conversation. We haven't sort of said we're living in a swap line world. We're living in a world of sort of flexible currencies that are still managed. And I think there's a good argument that it's a sort of it is the international complement to domestic monetary sovereignty in many respects. Perry Merling has a great line. He said, solvency doesn't exist. There's only liquidity. And if you think about it kind of like that, then what provisioning of international liquidity you have is the ball game in terms of, until you get to those questions of sovereign debt restructuring that Karina was talking about. But we can also take lessons from this at the domestic level. If you're in the United States, for example, and you're talking about federalism here, you can talk about or think about a nested currency at the state level or the local level. You can think about swap lines within a country at the state level as well as internationally. And the idea of a kind of swap line framework is a way to combine monetary sovereignty with a world in which there are multiple publics, often overlapping and things like that. But to go back to my kind of overall theme of my talk about digital currency, one of the things we saw with swap lines was that when they were first introduced, and even today, they continue to be primarily aimed at, as Nathan mentioned, private credit markets, private banking systems, and providing liquidity there. But if we move to a digital currency world where a lot of that private credit is made explicitly public money from day one, rather than simply private money with a public backstop, then this question of liquidity provisioning, that expanded central bank balance sheet to take on all of that sort of currently shadow money into the sort of explicit public monetary system, is going to require a hell of a lot more open debate about liquidity provisioning. So if we want to build a future digital currency world where people are actually able to use it on a sort of mass basis across countries, we're going to run headfirst into this question about liquidity swap lines, whether we like it or not. And it's useful to know that sort of where we're going if we think about the design of new technologies.
And just to echo Rohan's kind of comments, I think actually it's such an interesting question, right? Because on the domestic scene in law and political economy, it's usually very domestic. And then it doesn't think about how the domestic context is embedded within this international thing that's happening and comes out of that, as if like Britain's power wasn't about its colonies and the US power isn't about what's happening outside of its borders. And this, so you have that on one hand. And then on another hand, you have most of the public international lawyers sort of keep an arm's length distance from international finance or international economic law, especially if it's dealing with money or sort of like actual financial operations. They'll talk about trade. They'll mention the IMF or the World Bank, right? But it never pushes. And then within the international financial law literature, it's largely conservative and they do really bad political science and theory and they can get away with it. Right? So you've had these like sort of three different things happening and not talking. So I share that with you. It's sort of like this moment of trying to figure out how to bring these three things together in new ways, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely work that all of you are engaging in deeply in ways that I have not yet had the time to dive into in the level of detail that I'd like. But I definitely plan to in the future, and I hope a lot of the listeners do too. So I think we have time for one more question before 12:30, and I know Raul can clarify this. I know there was some talk about staying after as well for some discussion and some questions. So I'm just going to ask a question. Apologies if I am pronouncing your name wrong. From Lou Karine. Can you talk a bit about what our imaginative horizon for global currency management should be? Is Bancor still the right starting point?
Yeah, so I think that question's a little bit overlaps with what we were talking about earlier. I think in limited context, as I just said, support issuing SDRs, which, in some sense are kind of like a little bit of a faded version of the Bancor, as Keynes' old proposal. But in general, I think I'm on the skeptical side to a global currency being capital T the solution, because if we think about money as inherently this political entity that contains the stresses and conflicts that people have over resources, over cultural identity, over all sorts of things, the differences that they are trying to manage. It seems to me that an international currency, a single international currency, kind of puts the cart before the horse in terms of changing the relations between countries. How in a world still defined by 20th century colonialism and neo-colonial relations, how do you issue a global currency that provides justice for the global South? I think a proposal to issuing STRs is certainly an improvement and a salve, and I think it would benefit the global South much more than it would benefit the global North. But I don't think it. I think it. Me, I see it as a stopgap measure. So in that context, it seems to me that it's the future, or the horizon of possibility is more in alliances along the global South, using tools like swap lines and other tools to build power and build arrangements within the global South to challenge Western hegemony and to challenge dollar hegemony and dollar dominance, and reduce or take off the rough edges of the international currency hierarchy, and of course, essentially expand post-colonial monetary sovereignty. And so that's the context in which I'm thinking about these sorts of arrangements. And I think there's can be a place for supranational currencies in that space, but there needs to be a free and easy process of exit, so that so that like some sort of supernatural currency um, don't become vice traps the way the euro has become.
I think I'm more optimistic about a banker style kind of arrangement, but I agree that this would have to be discussed in more detail. I think, well, probably this is something we should kind of work on, some kind of symposium on the viability and desirability of the banker. I don't know, but I think it would definitely be a kind of structural solution to the sovereign debt crisis problem, in the sense that it would work on mitigating those asymmetries between deficit countries, surplus countries, and yeah, I think, well, the time is so limited to discuss that, but I'm more optimistic in the sense that the SDRs, granted, they would benefit the global periphery right now, but I don't see this as a structural change. First, because most of the SDRs would go to the countries that hold that control the IMF's quotas, which are core countries. And second, I don't think the IMF's governance is something we should keep either. I mean, yeah, I totally agree with the SDR proposal right now, but I don't see this as, like the final point which we should kind of aim for. And so I think the banker has has this kind of powerful proposal, but I see what you mean as well. So, but yeah, just some thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of ideas as provocations, thinking about how these interventions have an effect on the discourse even before we get to them actually being implemented as policy. And on one hand, I think Karina's point is very well taken. The IMF and other institutions like that at the international financial level are often reflect the political economy of the countries that are funding them and the arrangements that brought them into being. And we've seen the effect of having a sort of single centralized actor that can impose fiscal discipline on democratic or sort of national polities without a feedback mechanism through the ECB. I remember back in sort of 2011, 2010, there was a sort of interest in South American countries in moving towards some sort of monetary union that was basically dropped, I believe, sort of after watching the failures of the European model. But if you think about, global geopolitical alignments, that the ability to scale of a large Euro union, whether it's United States or the ECB or someone like China, I think gives a degree of countervailing power at the international system that we can't presume is going to be achieved by a single centralized entity absent some sort of global democratic governance or something. And so in that respect, I think there's a way in which swapline networks at the regional level can be a sort of framework forward for regional multilateralism. The other thing I think that's very powerful about the swapline network is because it focuses on currency to currency liquidity, right? It works regardless of what the kind of entity issuing the currency is. So I sort of mentioned before, you could have subnational currencies where the United States is part of a global swapline network, but it also is part of a domestic swapline network with state currencies or local currencies and things. But you can also imagine it with private civil currencies, which can transcend potentially state borders if you wanted to. So if you want to think about, for example, greening the global financial system or sort of creating ecological concerns that transcend national borders, it would be possible to use a swapline framework to think about other kinds of currencies that achieve particular effects internationally that aren't domestic national currencies. And in that respect, the swapline network framework, at least to me, is a good bridge between a world where state monies are sort of predominant and a world in which there's a wider range of monetary kind of pluralism or diversity. And that framework allows us to accommodate both in a smooth way.
Great, thank you, everybody. So we're over time at this point. I wanted to get a gauge of you all, whether you wanted to stay on, answer one more question, or whether we should leave it at this. Yeah, one more. Yeah, okay, cool. So this one is also fairly broad, but it talks to the balance of kind of domestic versus international focus in LPE and international money. So is the relative priority from your LPE perspective using the opportunity of the new economy to finance the Green New Deal from an economics and engineering perspective, or to reassert a more equitable, peer participatory, post-neoliberal sovereign dynamic from an international law perspective?
Yeah, I guess I'll take the first bite of that. I definitely think the Green New Deal is a big part of our vision here. My colleagues, Raul, who or co-organizer of this, and Andreas Bernal, we wrote an op-ed in Business Insider that about the Green New Deal and about how it should be, 100% on the federal government's tab. And in that, part of our concern is that was with a lot of proposals that justified a Green New Deal on the basis of the intellectual property that it would accumulate in the United States. And that intellectual property, being corporations who were domiciled in the United States, based in the United States, and interested in not just in profits in general, but dollar-denominated profits, would be denominating access to that intellectual property in dollars, which would have this foreclosing of what should be a commons to the rest of the global South, and sharpening these the international currency hierarchy in the context of climate change. And so and we're seeing right now with the coronavirus vaccine the difficulties and problems that of foreclosing access to the global South to coronavirus vaccines based on access to dollars and willingness to pay dollars, or other dominant currencies like pounds. And so I think in that context, for us, a lot of our Green New Deal conversations is focused on United States policy, but in an internationalist context of wanting things like patent left, which is kind of like copyleft, but for these specific technologies, and to open up this intellectual property and not make it an imposition of dollars, but instead respecting that knowledge is free and freely accessible, and instead using alternative mechanisms to intellectual property to finance these innovations. So I think in that that's a chunk of the conversation. But as I said, we're talking about a field that doesn't exist yet, and so for me, what the first step is to understand the constraints that are imposed by the existing system, and then the next step after that is how to peel away or push away some of those constraints. And we make proposals in the U.S. policy context that are aimed at loosening these global constraints, but obviously there's also the other angle, which is very important, especially when friends of ours are getting elected in places like Ecuador. It's important to focus on their perspective, which will necessarily be antagonistic to that global hierarchy.
I think we should never underestimate how hard it is to get power to concede power. And if we look at the history in the Anglo-American global governance, right, and broadly in Europe, there's always a tendency to exterminate or lock down before to be inclusive. Yeah, so we're struggling against something which historically and just is so, and this is the way it's done. And it seems to me that if we look at the history of these efforts from the NIEO and afterwards, and all these different arrangements in Latin America and so forth, we see all these different ways that those efforts get subverted, and all the sort of problems that right. So at least like I agree with you, Nathan, that it has to be international, and wherever you have friends and you try to collaborate and help. I can't help thinking though that a lot of where the action's going to take place is in where the dominant powers are. So, and it's changed. So like if the US had a different policy, if it had a long range thinking, was thinking like, what happens when we're not the major hegemon, right? Or when we're sharing the scene in 30 to 50 years. And if we could change US policy towards Ecuador, etc., that would do more good than anything else we could think of doing. This is just my feeling. I could be wrong on this, but it just seems to me that these fights, and it gets when we're on the domestic level, we can just see how difficult it is, right? Like how steep the political wall is that we have to fight to do this. It just becomes very overt and real if we just look at how like racial inequality happens in America. And then we try to think about how that would work if we walked outside our borders where people don't even experience other people. So it's a difficult, I don't know. I wonder how other people feel about this. This is part of what MMT is so exciting to me, is that it comes right to the heart of power again. And the Green New Deal, it sort of like puts the US front and center and says like, the change doesn't happen aberrationally out there or getting other people to get up to your standard. It has to begin with an actual modeling of your own behavior.
I think those questions, I know the question kind of is trying to oppose those two things in terms of relative priorities, but I do believe that those things are kind of indissociable from each other, because ultimately, if you think about the green transition from a global perspective, instead of just kind of being just domestic, just focusing on the local level, ultimately where environmental destruction manifests itself in the more profound level is through commodity production and extractivism in the global periphery, through the exploitation of those resources and in a kind of global context in which the periphery feeds the core by providing resources. And there are multiple theories about why those resources are, the terms of trade are asymmetric and so on. But ultimately, this is like still a manifestation of a sort of the same colonialist kind of dynamic in which the resources are extracted in an unsustainable way. So we need to think about, in a kind of global political economy of the green transition, how can we create a sustainable global economy, really? And if we do that, I'm sure it will certainly be more just as well, because the injustices, the imbalances that exist are all based on this kind of extractivist dynamic.
Yeah, I agree with Karina. I think it's definitely a false dichotomy. I mean, in one sense, we obviously have to address the climate crisis, right? And the reality is, I think because to some degree we have to, we're going to in some way, and it's going to be done poorly or well. And I mean, John's point that we should never underestimate the ability of powerful interests to sort of keep power under their control is definitely kind of the way that I think of it as well. And the way that I think of these kind of conversations around international money is, well, where's the relative edge here? Where's the sort of opportunity to have an intervention that could be disproportionate to our level of power more generally? How could we sort of leverage this moment or leverage a certain kind of understanding or for example, not only kind of who's in the room, but even knowing which room things are taking place to put pressure on. Just to give one example, in the United States, a group called Fed Up, which was sort of mostly low-income people of color, started protesting at the Federal Reserve about keeping sort of interest rates low to push for full employment, and had a pretty significant impact, even with sort of 30 to 50 people protesting. And one of the reasons was that the Fed wasn't used to direct political action outside its doors. We can sort of think back to the 1990s WTO protests and things, but when we think about swap lines or the future of sort of budget sustainability, who's protesting outside of those rooms, or what even are those rooms? And so when the time comes to know that there's an inevitable fight over how we respond to climate, if it's going to be sort of eco-fascism versus some sort of egalitarian, equitable new world, then we need to know where those flashpoints are, right? Where those crisis moments where there's going to be an intervention opportunity are. And I think the kinds of competencies that we're trying to bring to the forefront are ones in which, we want progressives to own the narrative, to own the space. And these are, I think, in many respects, weak points in the armor of neoliberalism or power that we've tried to identify and say, hey, we can have a disproportionate impact here, right? This area, no, this is the broadside armor. Here's the chink in the armor that we can kind of actually get something done if we put the energy into. And that's the value here, rather than framing one against the other. It's how can we intervene in a way to move the trajectory in the direction we want it to.
Yeah,
Hey,
I mean,
Nathan, let me just ask a question to put to the two of you. Like, so, like, I don't disagree with any of that. One thing I struggle with is I think about the history of, colonialists never thought they were being bad guys, right? Like, like they tended to think they really were reformers. They really were trying to help. If you read their private letters, there's a history of going, like, thinking that, like the Westerner going abroad to try to help, right, give expert advice, and it always is the same story in different varieties. So on one hand, I get very self-conscious that if you can't change your own neighborhood, or you can't change your own locality, especially if it's on the top of the hill right now, then why are you going down to other, you know what I mean? Like, there's that danger. And maybe stopping the spigot at the top, right, that's flooding down below, is probably the best thing you can do than help give people buckets.
I
On
mean,
the other hand, then you got friends in other countries and that are really struggling. And like, when Greece was going through everything, it really would make a difference to have gone a different way, right? Or, we talk about Ecuador or Mexico and all these different stories. And I'm still trying to find my way of understanding how to navigate that. I was wondering how you guys feel about that.
I mean, I think there's a couple things there. One is that, we're not the proverbial Westerner coming with the expert advice, in the sense that, we're part of these solidaristic networks that include people from the global south, and we're trying to build collectively with other people. When in the international law, monetary sovereignty, in the international context, we're working with a lot of different people like Ndongo Silla, and building it's an intellectual project that isn't a strictly Western intellectual project at this point. It might have started that way, but it's not. And even early on, it had people like Fidel Kaboub getting involved. And so one thing is, I don't think this is a strictly Western project, but the other thing is, the more conventional Western expert is already there, and it's not only there, but it's been reproduced intellectually through neoclassical education and law, including law and economics education, all throughout the global South, and it dominates policymaking in other countries. Part of confronting the Western neoliberal influence is, lending a hand in intellectual battles in other countries, and not just in the U.S. So I think those are kind of the two elements that I would emphasize. So it kind of makes this like a battle. This is just one of those areas where you gotta try to do everything at once, as hard as that is. The other thing is, I think the only way to get people in the United States to understand the importance of deconstructing the international monetary hierarchy is to emphasize that, first of all, it exists, and that it's politically and legally designed, and that it is the thing constraining a lot of countries. It's not, oh, they're just the bottom billion, and oh, they just have that naturalized poverty over there, that it's actually a social relation of deprivation with neocolonial powers, and we need understanding that relation in fact exists, is a big part of destabilizing it in the West as well. So I think it serves that dual function of being able to start to see some of the constraints, and see where constraints can be loosened on the global South side, but also making people in the West more understand that these constraints exist, and that our internal transformation projects like the Green New Deal need to have profound positive implications for the international currency hierarchy, including patent lifting the intellectual fruits of the Green New Deal, the job guarantee, and so on and so forth.
I totally agree. Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, go
right. I totally agree with Nathan. And I know it's hard, but it's very important to have this awareness, even if you're not working strictly on something international. I mean, I think it's crucial to have this awareness, because sometimes domestic projects that can look very progressive, if you don't have this awareness that they may have global implications that are extremely problematic, then you can end up, you can generate the opposite effect of what you're trying to achieve. So, for example, as Nathan was mentioning, the Green New Deal in the US, if you don't have an awareness of currency hierarchy or even IP property, intellectual property rights that may exacerbate the technological gap, for example, with the periphery. Or if you think about like clean energy, so on, like the lithium that you use to produce electric cars in the core, like if you don't think about where it comes from, and the political economy dimension of the lithium extraction, for example, like that can look very progressive and clean, but is that really, I mean, I'm not saying we should rely on fossil fuels. I'm just saying, that adds an extra layer of complexity to local discussions as well. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think on one hand, there is a sort of some dimension of national exceptionalism around those kind of global leaders. I mean, on one hand, New York law, London law governs so much of international finance, for example, all the international institutions who are based in the United States, even things like English speaking, or the way in which English is the basis of a lot of digital technology and coding and things like that, puts people who are maybe native English speakers in the largest English speaking country in the world, et cetera, in a unique position to sort of take advantage of those kind of capacities. But there's also sort of, just as a basic level, that the imperialism of the ideas as well has a dynamic that needs to be addressed. So I've gone to digital currency conversations, and the central bankers often at the periphery are often the ones doing the most interesting work, but they're also trained at the global center. They also feel constrained by what happens there. It's those big countries that when they move, everything goes with them. So in some respects, I think Nathan's right, but it's also a matter of kind of solidarity and sharing the power and saying, hey, the struggles that we're doing over here aren't just ours. It isn't just a matter of kind of we keep our house under control. What goes on in Rome matters for everybody at the periphery of the Roman Empire and beyond. And as an Australian who moved to the United States, and I'm sure Karina is someone who's, the idea of kind of coming to the core to try to deal with those questions isn't a matter of deprioritizing the periphery. It's just recognizing the respective kind of why'd you rob the bank? Well, that's where the money is kind of dynamic.
So this has been like incredibly interesting and illuminating. We're now like 20 minutes over, so I think I have to call a wrap on this. But I learned so much, even more than I expected, and I expected a lot. Thank you so much to the panelists for this discussion. It was just fantastic. So I also wanted to say, I don't think that we're going to have a discussion with all of the audience now, but people should stay tuned for more updates and programming in this space. There should be more forthcoming soon. And with that, yeah, thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for everyone who is still there listening to us.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.